Wembley Stadium, 1985. 82,000 people screaming "Freedom!" into the night sky. George and Andrew standing center stage, under the spotlights, at the top of the world. If you look at the photographs from that night, you see two happy young men living their dream. But backstage, where the cameras couldn't reach, George Michael was having a panic attack. His hands were shaking, he couldn't breathe. And Andrew Ridgeley, trying to help him, realized something was very wrong. But they didn't talk about it that day. They performed. They smiled. They waved. Because the show had to go on. But a year later, in 1986, in a quiet London studio, George couldn't smile anymore. And he told Andrew the truth. "Every time I go on stage, I die a little. Every photograph is a lie. Every interview is a performance. And I can't do it anymore." Andrew was shocked. How could this be? George Michael, the perfect pop star in the world's eyes. How could he be so miserable? The answer was simple and devastating. Because George Michael wasn't real. He was a character, a brand, a stage name. And the real George, Georgios Panayotou, was drowning beneath that character. That night, Andrew cried, because his best friend had just confessed something. "If I don't end WHAM, I'll end myself." And Andrew knew he had to take that seriously. Before we reveal what happened that night in the studio and why it changed everything, please subscribe to our channel and turn on notifications. This is the untold story of WHAM's breakup and the price of stardom. To understand why WHAM ended, you need to understand how it began. George and Andrew met in 1975 at Bushy Meads Comprehensive School in Hertfordshire. George was 12 years old, shy, insecure, the son of Greek Cypriot immigrants trying to fit in. Andrew was confident, popular, everything George wasn't. But somehow they became best friends. They bonded over music. The Beatles, Elton John, David Bowie. These were the artists they listened to together, dreaming of one day making their own music. And that dream never faded. Through their teenage years, through different schools and different paths, George and Andrew held on to the idea that they would form a band together, that they would make it big, that they would change the world. In 1981, they made it official. They called themselves WHAM and started writing songs in Andrew's parents' living room. George was the primary songwriter and vocalist. Andrew played guitar and provided backing vocals. But more importantly, he was George's confidence, his support system, the person who believed in him when nobody else did. Together, they created a sound that was fresh, energetic, and infectious. Pop music with an edge, songs about youth and freedom and fun. And in 1982, they released their first single, WHAM Rap, Enjoy What You Do. It didn't chart well initially, but it got attention. Radio stations played it. Music journalists noticed them, and WHAM was on its way. Their breakthrough came in 1983 with Young Guns, Go For It, and Bad Boys. Both songs hit the UK top 10, and suddenly WHAM was everywhere. MTV played their videos on repeat. Teenagers bought their records, and George and Andrew, barely in their 20s, found themselves living the dream they had talked about since they were 12. But success came fast. Too fast. Within a year, WHAM went from unknown to massive. And with that success came pressure. Pressure to perform, pressure to maintain the image, pressure to be perfect all the time. And George, who had always been insecure and anxious, felt that pressure more than anyone. But in 1984, WHAM released the song that would define them forever. And it would also begin George's unraveling. Last Christmas was released in December 1984, and it became an instant classic. The song was everywhere. Radio stations played it constantly. It reached number 2 on the UK charts, only kept from the top spot by Band-Aids, Do They Know It's Christmas? And every year since, Last Christmas has returned to the charts, becoming one of the most played Christmas songs of all time. It made Wham! Immortal. But what most people don't know is that George wrote Last Christmas during one of the darkest periods of his life. He wrote it about heartbreak, about a relationship that had failed, about the pain of loving someone who didn't love you back. And that pain was real, because George was struggling with his identity, with his sexuality, with the person he was pretending to be versus the person he actually was. The success of Last Christmas brought even more attention to Wham! More tours, more interviews, more photo shoots, more pressure to maintain the image of the carefree, fun-loving pop duo. And George was cracking under that pressure. Andrew could see it. The way George would retreat into himself before performances, the way he would avoid eye contact during interviews, the way he would disappear for hours after shows, not wanting to talk to anyone. But Andrew didn't know how to help, because from the outside, everything looked perfect. Wham! Was selling millions of records. They were headlining stadiums. They were living the dream. How could George be unhappy? In 1985, Wham! Became the first Western pop group to perform in China. It was a historic moment, covered by media around the world. 10,000 people attended the concert in Beijing, and millions more watched on television. George and Andrew were cultural ambassadors, breaking down barriers between East and West. It should have been the highlight of their career. But for George, it was torture. Because every moment of that trip was documented. Every smile was photographed. Every word was recorded. And George felt like he was suffocating, like he was trapped in a role he couldn't escape, and the more successful Wham! Became, the more trapped he felt. Then came Wembley Stadium in June 1985. And that's when Andrew realized just how bad things had gotten. June 1985. Wham! Was scheduled to perform at Wembley Stadium as part of a massive outdoor concert. 82,000 people filled the stadium. It was one of the biggest shows of their career. And backstage, an hour before they were supposed to go on, George was falling apart. Andrew found him in the dressing room, sitting on the floor, hyperventilating. His hands were shaking uncontrollably. Sweat poured down his face. He looked at Andrew with eyes full of panic and said he couldn't do it. He couldn't go on stage. He couldn't face 82,000 people. He couldn't pretend anymore. Andrew had never seen George like this. Sure, George got nervous before big shows. All performers did. But this was different. This was a full panic attack. George was having a physical and psychological breakdown right there in the dressing room. And Andrew didn't know what to do. He tried to calm George down, tried to remind him that they had done this hundreds of times before, that once he got on stage, the adrenaline would kick in and he would be fine. But George just kept shaking his head, saying he couldn't, he couldn't, he couldn't. And for a terrifying moment, Andrew thought the show might not happen, that George might actually refuse to go on stage. And then what? How would they explain to 82,000 people that Wham! Wasn't performing? But somehow, George pulled himself together. He took deep breaths. He splashed water on his face. He put on the costume. And when it was time, he walked out on that stage and performed like nothing was wrong. He sang Freedom with energy and confidence. He danced. He smiled at the crowd. And the 82,000 people in the stadium had no idea that an hour earlier their idol had been on the floor having a breakdown. But Andrew knew, and as he stood on that stage, playing guitar next to his best friend, Andrew felt a cold fear settle in his chest. Because he realized something that night. George was good at pretending. Too good. He could perform happiness while dying inside. And that was terrifying. After the show, Andrew tried to talk to George about what had happened, but George brushed it off, said it was just nerves. just the pressure of such a big show. He promised Andrew it was fine, that it wouldn't happen again. And Andrew wanted to believe him, because the alternative, that his best friend was genuinely struggling, was too painful to confront. So they moved on. They continued touring. They continued promoting. They continued being WHAM, but the cracks were showing. And they were getting wider. By early 1986, George had made a decision. He was going to break up WHAM. He hadn't told Andrew yet, hadn't told management, hadn't told anyone. But in his mind, it was already done. Because George knew he couldn't continue. The panic attacks were getting worse, the depression was deepening, and the facade, the performance of being George Michael the pop star, was becoming unbearable. He needed out. He needed to stop pretending. He needed to find himself again, or what was left of himself beneath all the lies. But George was terrified of telling Andrew, because breaking up WHAM meant ending Andrew's career too. Andrew was part of the group, but everyone knew George was the talent. George wrote the songs. George sang the leads. George was the star. Andrew was, in many ways, along for the ride. And that wasn't Andrew's fault. Andrew had never pretended to be the musical genius. He was there as George's friend, his support, his partner. But if WHAM ended, Andrew's pop career would likely end too. And George knew that. He knew that his decision to save himself would hurt Andrew. And the guilt of that knowledge was crushing. In the spring of 1986, George and Andrew met in a small recording studio in London. It was late at night. The city was quiet. And George finally told Andrew the truth. He explained that he couldn't continue with WHAM, that the pressure was killing him, that every performance felt like dying, that every interview felt like lying, that the person the world knew as George Michael wasn't real, and he needed to find out who he actually was before it was too late. And then George said something that broke Andrew's heart. "If I don't end WHAM, I'll end myself." It wasn't a dramatic statement. It wasn't said for effect. It was a simple, honest confession. George was telling Andrew that continuing WHAM felt like a choice between the band and his life. And he was choosing his life. Andrew sat there in silence, processing what he had just heard. And then he started crying. Not loud, dramatic crying. Just quiet tears running down his face as he stared at his best friend. Because Andrew realized something in that moment. He was losing George. Not to death, not yet, but to something almost as final. The George he had grown up with, the George he had made music with, the George who had been his partner in this crazy dream, was gone. Replaced by someone haunted and hurt and desperate to escape. Andrew wanted to be angry, wanted to argue, wanted to say that they could fix this, that they could take a break, that they could make it work. But when he looked at George's eyes, he saw something that stopped all those words. He saw genuine pain, genuine fear. And he saw the truth of what George was saying. This wasn't about the music or the fame or the money. This was about survival. George was drowning, and breaking up WHAM was his only way to reach the surface. So Andrew did the only thing he could do. He supported his friend. He agreed to the breakup. And he cried because he knew that nothing would ever be the same again. WHAM announced their breakup in May 1986, shocking fans around the world. To give fans a proper goodbye, they scheduled a final concert at Wembley Stadium for June 28, 1986. Tickets sold out instantly. 72,000 people packed the stadium. Millions more watched on television. It was one of the most watched concerts of the decade, and it was designed to be a celebration, a farewell, a perfect ending to the WHAM story. But behind the scenes, it was emotionally devastating for both George and Andrew. The concert itself was spectacular. WHAM performed all their hits: Wake Me Up Before You Go Go, Freedom, Careless Whisper, Last Christmas, every song that had made them famous. The crowd sang along to every word. Elton John made a special appearance, joining them on stage. It was a massive, joyful celebration. But for George and Andrew, standing on that stage for the last time as Wham, it was heartbreaking. Because they both knew this was the end of something that had defined their lives for 5 years. The end of a dream they had shared since they were 12 years old. When the final song ended and they took their final bow, George and Andrew hugged on stage. And in that hug, there was everything they couldn't say out loud. Thank you, I'm sorry, I love you, goodbye. The crowd cheered, the cameras flashed, and Wham was over. After the concert, they went their separate ways. George retreated from public view to work on his solo career. Andrew stepped back from music entirely, knowing that without George, his pop career had no future. And the friendship that had sustained them both, that had brought them from a school in Hertfordshire to the biggest stages in the world, was fundamentally changed. They were still friends, technically. But the closeness, the partnership, the shared dream, all of it was gone. George's solo career exploded. Faith, released in 1987, sold 25 million copies worldwide and turned George Michael into a global superstar. But the success didn't bring happiness. Instead, it brought more pressure, more scrutiny, more lies to maintain. Because George was still hiding his sexuality, still pretending to be someone he wasn't, and the depression that had started during Wham only got worse. He developed addictions, he had public scandals, he was arrested multiple times, and through it all, Andrew watched from a distance, unable to help the friend he had once been so close to. In interviews over the years, Andrew spoke carefully about the Wham breakup. He always supported George's decision, always said it was the right thing to do, but there was always a sadness beneath his words, a sense of loss, because breaking up Wham had cost Andrew more than just a career, it had cost him his best friend. They stayed in touch, but it was different. George was consumed by his own struggles, his own demons, and Andrew, who had been there at the beginning, who had believed in George before anyone else, couldn't reach him anymore. Then on Christmas Day 2016, George Michael was found dead in his home. He was 53 years old, and Andrew Ridgeley had to confront the fact that his best friend was gone. The person he had made music with, dreamed with, grown up with, was dead. And all Andrew could think about was that night in 1986 in the London studio, when George had said, "If I don't end Wham, I'll end myself." George had ended Wham to save himself. But in the end, it hadn't been enough. The demons were too strong, the damage too deep. And Andrew was left with the painful knowledge that nothing he could have done would have changed the outcome. Because George's struggle wasn't about Wham, it was about identity, about sexuality, about the suffocating pressure of living a lie. And breaking up the band had only been the first step in a journey George could never complete. Years after George's death, Andrew finally spoke openly about that night in the studio in 1986. About the conversation that ended Wham, he revealed that George had been crying too that night, not just him, that they had sat together for hours, talking about everything they had been through, about the dream they had shared as kids, about how fame had twisted that dream into something unrecognizable, about how George felt like he was losing himself, piece by piece, performance by performance, and about how ending Wham was George's desperate attempt to find himself again before it was too late. Andrew admitted that he had been angry at first, hurt that George was making a decision that would end Andrew's career without really consulting him. But that anger had faded quickly when he saw how much pain George was in, because in that moment, Andrew realized that being a good friend meant letting go, meant supporting George's decision even though it hurt, meant prioritizing George's mental health over the band. And so Andrew had cried, not just for the end of Wham, but for the loss of his friend. Because even though George was sitting right there, Andrew knew he was already gone. The pressure, the lies, the performance had taken the real George away. And what was left was someone Andrew barely recognized. That night in the studio, Andrew asked George one question. Was it worth it? All the success, all the fame, all the money, was it worth what it cost? And George's answer was immediate and heartbreaking. No. Because what had it cost? It had cost George his identity, his authenticity, his peace. It had forced him to hide who he really was for years. It had given him panic attacks and depression. It had turned his life into a performance he couldn't escape. And even breaking up WHAM, even trying to step back and find himself, hadn't been enough to undo the damage. Andrew Ridgeley cried that night in 1986 because he understood something that most people never see. That fame comes with a price that's often too high to pay. That success can be a prison as much as poverty. That the person the world celebrates can be dying inside. And that sometimes the kindest thing you can do for someone you love is let them go, even when it breaks your heart. WHAM's music lives on. Last Christmas plays every holiday season. Wake Me Up Before You Go Go still gets people dancing. And new generations discover their music and fall in love with it. But the story of WHAM isn't just a story of hit songs and sold-out stadiums. It's a story of friendship and sacrifice, of two kids who had a dream and achieved it, only to discover that dreams come with costs they never imagined. George Michael paid the ultimate price, losing himself in the pursuit of perfection and spending the rest of his life trying to find his way back. And Andrew Ridgeley paid a different price, losing his best friend and his career, but gaining the painful wisdom that sometimes love means letting go. That night in the studio in 1986, when Andrew cried and George confessed that stardom was killing him, was the beginning of the end for both of them. Not just the end of WHAM, but the end of innocence, the end of the belief that success equals happiness, the end of the dream they had shared since they were 12 years old. And in its place came a harsh reality, that the music industry can destroy the people it celebrates. That fame is a monster that devours authenticity, and that sometimes saving yourself means sacrificing everything else. Andrew Ridgeley has lived with that knowledge for decades, and when George died in 2016, Andrew was left with one final painful truth. Breaking up WHAM had saved George's life for 30 years, but it hadn't saved him forever, because the damage was already done. The lies, the pressure, the performance, all of it had left scars that never healed. And in the end, George Michael, the character created to hide Georgios Panayotou, had won. The real George had been lost somewhere along the way. And no amount of success, no number of hit records, no level of fame could bring him back.